He laughed. Not a belly laugh. Not even the kind of chuckle shared between friends. It was sharper than that. A smirk disguised as humor, a sound that dripped with condescension. Justice Brett Kavanaugh leaned back in his chair, the faintest shake of his head, chuckling as if Jasmine Crockett's words were beneath him. In that moment, the courtroom transformed. It wasn't just law being debated. It was dignity itself placed on trial. The marble columns, the solemn silence of the chamber, the weight of centuries of precedent, all of it seemed to bend toward that single act of arrogance. Jasmine Crockett stood at the podium, unflinching. Her voice had carried conviction, her argument laid with precision, yet his laugh sought to reduce it to nothing more than a punchline. The contrast was striking. One figure cloaked in smugness, the other armored in calm. The room held its breath. Some eyes darted toward Crockett, waiting to see if she would stumble. Others narrowed at Kavanaugh, questioning the audacity of his contempt. He laughed in her face, but what came next left the chamber stunned and turned a dismissive chuckle into the spark of something unforgettable. The laughter may have seemed small, a fleeting chuckle echoing against marble walls. But beneath its surface lay something much larger. The weight of history, the struggle for fairness, and the fight for dignity that generations had carried into that very chamber. For women across America, the sound was all too familiar, the dismissive scoff that meets their ideas in boardrooms, classrooms, and courtrooms alike. It was not just about Jasmine Crockett. It was about every woman who had been laughed at for daring to speak her truth. This hearing was never meant to be entertainment. It carried real consequences, decisions shaping families, freedoms, and futures. And yet, Kavanaugh's chuckle reduced it to theater, a spectacle in which his power granted him permission to sneer. That laugh said more than words ever could, that he believed himself untouchable, that her voice carried less weight than his smirk. But in that instant, Crockett represented something bigger than herself. She stood for immigrants who had clawed their way into spaces where they were told they didn't belong. She stood for young women told to know their place. She stood for every American who believes justice demands seriousness, not mockery. Kavanaugh's arrogance set the tone, but Crockett's silence in that moment was deceptive. She wasn't rattled. She wasn't shrinking. She was sharpening. Her calm eyes held the quiet fury of someone who had been here before, someone who knew that laughter may wound, but it cannot erase truth. The chamber did not yet know it, but that smirk was about to cost Kavanaugh dearly. Because Jasmine Crockett wasn't about to let the mockery pass. She wasn't about to let the chuckle linger as the final word. And when she finally spoke again, the smirk would vanish. Brett Kavanaugh did not stumble into power. He was groomed for it, raised in the polished corridors of privilege. His life was a study in insulation, elite schools, exclusive networks, and a career trajectory greased by connections few Americans could ever dream of. From the beginning, his path was less about grit and more about entitlement, a narrative not of climbing, but of being lifted. When he first stepped into the national spotlight during his confirmation hearings, the nation saw a portrait of that entitlement in real time. The sharp bursts of anger, the indignant defiance, the infamous line about loving beer. These weren't just quirks. They were revelations. They told America what it meant for someone raised in the culture of untouchability to be pressed, to be challenged, to be forced to answer. His reactions weren't those of a humble servant of justice, but of a man outraged that anyone dared question his right to sit on the highest bench in the land. And yet, despite the gravity of the proceedings, he treated the hearings as theater. Each chuckle, each smirk, each impatient sigh carried the same message, that the system would protect him, that no matter how pointed the questions or how damning the testimony, his appointment was inevitable. And, in many ways, he was right. The powerful rallied around him. He survived the storm, elevated not because the doubts were erased, but because his allies decided the doubts didn't matter. That arrogance never left him. From his seat on the court, Kavanaugh projected the image of solemn duty, but beneath the black robe lay the same smirk, the same dismissive arrogance that had become his calling card. He had power now, immense, unshakable power, and with it, the confidence that his word could reshape the law, rewrite precedent, and alter the lives of millions. For ordinary Americans watching, this contradiction was glaring. The man entrusted with guarding the Constitution seemed to treat justice not as a sacred duty, but as a stage for his wit. What should have been reverence appeared as ridicule. What should have been solemnity was met with snickers. And in a chamber where voices trembled with the weight of history, his laughter fell like a slap. This wasn't the first time he mocked others. Colleagues had whispered about his impatience, about the way he rolled his eyes at arguments he deemed unworthy. Opponents had described the quiet derision that dripped from his tone when speaking of those outside his ideological circle. Time and again, his demeanor revealed the same truth. Brett Kavanaugh believed his place was secured, his perspective was superior, and his challengers deserved mockery rather than respect. But arrogance carries a flaw. It blinds those who wield it. In dismissing others, the arrogant fail to see when the ground beneath them shifts. And on that day, as Jasmine Crockett stood steady under the weight of his chuckle, something shifted. For the first time, his laughter was not absorbed in silence. It was not buried under procedure. It was met with calm, with dignity, with a sharpness that would cut through the smug exterior he had built around himself. This wasn't the first time he mocked others, but it would be the last time he got away unscathed. Jasmine Crockett's story is not one of shortcuts or silver spoons. It is the story of a woman who had to carve her own space in rooms that were never built with her in mind. Born far from the halls of power, she grew up with the understanding that dignity is not handed to you. It's defended day after day against those who believe you don't deserve it. Her early years were marked by persistence. While others leaned on inherited networks, Crockett leaned on grit. She worked her way through school, studied late into the night, and carried the weight of her family's hopes on her shoulders. Where privilege shields, her struggles sharpened. Every obstacle became training for the battles she would one day face in public life. As a young lawyer, she didn't chase glamorous firms or six-figure salaries. She chose public service. She represented clients who couldn't afford polished attorneys, people society had written off. Each case was more than a paycheck. It was a statement that justice should not be the private possession of the wealthy, but the birthright of every citizen. She walked into courtrooms where prosecutors smirked, where opposing counsel dismissed her, where judges underestimated her. And again, she refused to shrink. Her political rise followed the same path. Crockett never campaigned as someone entitled to power. She campaigned as someone who knew struggle firsthand. She spoke about housing, wages, dignity, not as abstract policies, but as lived realities. Voters heard in her voice not theory, but truth, and they responded, lifting her into office not because of her polish, but because of her persistence. By the time she stood in that chamber across from Justice Kavanaugh, Crockett was more than a congresswoman. She was the culmination of years spent in trenches others had avoided. Every time she'd been underestimated, every time her words had been brushed aside, every time her presence had been belittled, all of it had prepared her for this. She didn't rattle easily because she had already faced worse. She didn't flinch at condescension because she had endured it before. And unlike those who arrive at power cushioned by entitlement, Crockett arrived sharpened, tested, and utterly unafraid. And so, when Kavanaugh chuckled at her argument, he wasn't mocking only a statement. He was mocking the countless hours of labor, the years of struggle, the very spirit that had carried her here. What he saw as weakness was, in truth, the fire of resilience. And it was this background, this fire, that armed her with the perfect response. The silence after his laugh lingered like a shadow, and then the air seemed to tighten. Crockett pressed forward, her tone steady, her words measured, as though the chuckle had never happened. But everyone in the chamber felt the shift. The line between debate and disrespect had been crossed, and now every syllable carried new weight. Kavanaugh leaned slightly forward, his expression hovering between amusement and irritation. His eyes flickered with the kind of impatience reserved for someone convinced of his own superiority. Every nod, every half-smile dripped with the suggestion that her arguments were nothing more than noise. He wanted her to falter. He wanted her to reveal anger, to lose the poise that gave her power, but Crockett didn't bite. She adjusted her papers, locked eyes with him, and delivered her points with even more clarity, the rhythm of her speech rising like a steady drumbeat. The chamber shifted from restless to riveted. Each time he sighed or smirked, her words landed sharper, as though crafted to slice through the arrogance laid before her. Those watching could sense the tension mounting. It was no longer just about legal arguments. It had become a contest of will, a duel of dignity versus disdain. The villain smirked, but the hero stood firm. And with each second that passed, the laughter that once seemed so dismissive now felt like the opening move in a battle he was destined to lose. The escalation had begun. And then, with the entire chamber watching, Jasmine Crockett leaned in. She leaned forward, not in anger, but in precision, the way a fencer steadies before striking. The chamber hushed, a current of anticipation running through the air. Kavanaugh's chuckle still seemed to echo, but Crockett's eyes burned with the calm of someone who had endured far worse and learned how to turn insult into weapon. Her voice came low at first, controlled, deliberate. "Justice Kavanaugh," she began, "you may find my words amusing. But what I am speaking about is no laughing matter to the millions of Americans whose lives hang in the balance of this court's decisions." The words landed like a gavel, cutting through the smugness on his face. He shifted, still trying to maintain the mask of casual superiority, but the ripple in his expression betrayed him. Crockett pressed on, each sentence sharper than the last. She invoked the stories of women dismissed in workplaces, of immigrants mocked for their accents, of ordinary people crushed beneath rulings made by those who treated justice like a game. "They hear that laugh, too," she said. "And when they do, they recognize it. They've heard it in classrooms, in offices, in police stations. That laugh tells them they don't belong. But I am here to tell you, they do." The chamber seemed to lean toward her words. Even those who had looked down at their notes were now transfixed, sensing that the balance of power had shifted. Her tone rose, not in volume but in force, every syllable carrying the weight of lived truth. She spoke not just as a congresswoman, but as a vessel of every silenced voice. Kavanaugh tried to interject, his lips parting as if to reclaim control, but Crockett didn't yield. With surgical timing, she pressed harder. "Your role on this bench is not to belittle. It is not to dismiss. It is to serve, to uphold dignity, not diminish it, to protect the people, not laugh at them." Her eyes locked on his, unwavering, and for a moment, the man who once stormed through confirmation hearings with fiery entitlement looked unsettled. The audience felt it too. A rustle of shifting bodies, the faintest murmurs, a collective recognition that something extraordinary was happening. Crockett had turned mockery into revelation. She had taken his laugh, meant to reduce her, and reframed it as a symbol of everything wrong with the arrogance of unchecked power. Then came the line that would echo beyond the chamber, replayed on screens, clipped into headlines, turned into hashtags. She paused just long enough for silence to stretch, then delivered it with icy clarity. "You may laugh at me, Justice Kavanaugh, but history will not laugh with you." The words dropped like stone into still water, sending ripples across the room. Gasps broke the silence. Kavanaugh's smirk faltered, the corners of his mouth tightening as though he realized the cameras, the public, the weight of perception had shifted. His chuckle, once a display of dominance, now stood exposed as weakness. Crockett didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need theatrics. Her cold precision had pierced deeper than anger ever could. The duel was over. The crowd, the cameras, and the country knew it. She had turned the insult into a mic-drop moment that no laugh could erase. And as the echoes of her words hung in the chamber, the aftermath began to form. An aftermath that would spill beyond these walls and into the conscience of the nation. The silence after her final words felt almost sacred, as though even the walls of the chamber refused to interrupt. Then, slowly, the world beyond those walls roared awake. Reporters in the gallery scrambled to draft headlines. Cameras zoomed in on Kavanaugh's tightened jaw, on Crockett's unwavering poise. Within minutes, the clip was already spiraling across social media, reverberating far beyond the marble columns. On Twitter, hashtags erupted. Hashtag she shut him down. Hashtag Crockett versus Kavanaugh. Hashtag dignity over mockery. Memes appeared almost instantly. Screenshots of Kavanaugh's fading smirk paired with Crockett's devastating line. Influencers, activists, and everyday Americans flooded timelines with praise. That's the response we've been waiting for, one user wrote, racking up thousands of likes. Another captioned a viral video, when arrogance laughs, dignity silences it. Commentators took to the airwaves, some with awe, others with visible discomfort. Progressive hosts replayed the clip on loop, dissecting each pause, each syllable of Crockett's delivery, marveling at how she transformed mockery into mastery. Conservative pundits scrambled to spin it, but even they could not erase the sting of the moment. Kavanaugh's laugh, once casual, forgettable, was now a symbol of arrogance caught and crushed. Beyond the punditry, the public reaction swelled. Women in workplaces shared the clip in group chats, describing the familiar ache of being laughed at and the cathartic joy of seeing someone fire back with dignity. Immigrants spoke of recognition, of hearing in her words the defiance they had long carried. Young viewers, students, and first-time voters watched and whispered, "This is what standing tall looks like." Even within political circles, the impact was immediate. Lawmakers tweeted their support, praising Crockett for her composure. Allies spoke of her as a new voice of moral clarity. Rivals, silent in public, whispered unease in private. The ripple effect had begun. Crockett's cold response was no longer just a moment. It was a message. What Kavanaugh intended as a laugh had become the spark of a national conversation. What was meant to diminish had instead ignited. And as the clip continued to spread, it became clear this wasn't just courtroom drama. It was cultural reckoning. But Crockett herself? She wasn't finished. The moment had shifted the ground, and she was about to build on it, turning a smirk into a lesson America couldn't ignore. Jasmine Crockett could have left it there, a cutting line, a shattered smirk, a viral clip destined to circle the globe. But she knew the moment demanded more than a takedown. It demanded a truth that would linger long after the cameras turned off, a truth larger than any single exchange. Her voice steadied, not sharp now, but resonant, carrying the weight of every person who had ever been dismissed or belittled. "This chamber," she said, "is not a stage for laughter. It is a place where lives are decided, where futures are shaped. And every person who looks to this court for justice deserves to know that their dignity is not a joke." The words reached beyond the marble room. They were for women told their voices were too loud, for immigrants who had been mocked for their accents, for workers laughed at when demanding fair pay, for every American who had heard that same derisive chuckle and wondered if their worth was invisible. Crockett's message was clear. Dignity does not ask permission. It commands respect. She reframed the entire clash in universal terms. "You can laugh at me," she said, her gaze unyielding, "but you cannot laugh at the people I represent. You cannot laugh at justice. You cannot laugh at America's promise that every voice, every single one matters." In that moment, the courtroom felt transformed. The tension that had begun with mockery now swelled into something else, recognition. Even those who had sat stone-faced shifted in their chairs, confronted by the undeniability of her point. This was not about political tribes or partisan victories. It was about something deeper, the idea that arrogance will always try to belittle, but truth will always outlast it. Crockett embodied that truth, not with rage, but with resolve. Her calm was the rebuke. Her composure was the victory. And outside, the effect only grew. Teachers replayed her words in classrooms, framing them as lessons in dignity. Parents shared them with their children as reminders to stand tall. Activists stitched them into speeches and chants. What began as one woman's cold response became a chorus, echoing across the country. Kavanaugh's laugh had been meant to diminish. Instead, it became the backdrop against which Crockett delivered a universal reminder that dignity, once claimed, cannot be mocked away. The chamber fell into silence once more. But this time, the silence did not belong to arrogance. It belonged to truth. And as Crockett gathered her papers and stepped back, the nation knew one thing for certain. The laugh had ended, but the lesson was only beginning. He laughed, but she shut him down. What began as a dismissive chuckle became a defining moment. A reminder that arrogance will always try to silence, but dignity always finds its voice. Jasmine Crockett didn't just answer for herself. She answered for every person who has ever been laughed at and refused to bow. That is the power of truth, and that is the power of courage. If you believe in voices that won't be mocked, stand with us. Subscribe, share this story, and be part of a community that refuses to stay silent.